So hello, everyone, and welcome to another conversation of the fourth cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. My name is Maria da Piedade Ferreira, and today I am very glad and honored to introduce you to Tom Albright. Thomas D. Albright is professor and Conrad T. Prebys Chair at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, where he investigates the neural basis of vision and memory. An important goal of his work is development of therapies for blindness and perceptual impairments. A second aim is to use our growing knowledge of brain, perception, and memory to inform design in architecture and the arts, to leverage societal decisions and public policy, and to advise on matters of law and justice. Tom, thank you so much for accepting this invitation and sharing your knowledge with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to the discussion. And because we're such a small group, please don't hesitate to interrupt me anytime along the way. I'm going to share my screen, if I can do that. Let's see. Okay, do you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see it.
All right. There we go. So as Maria said, I'm a neuroscientist, and a number of years ago, I got interested in the problem of architecture, in large part because the part of the brain that I study is the part that enables you to see, the visual system, and vision is a very prominent feature of architectural experience. And I figured there was something that, some insights that I had about how the visual system worked that might be relevant to this. I also work at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, which is an extraordinary building designed by the mid-century modernist architect Lucan. That's part of the Salk Institute on the right-hand side of the slide there at dusk. And actually, I think that's in moonlight. I don't know if you can, yeah, there's the moon on the side. So I'll begin with this question. Gotta get all this other crap off my desktop here. Why is neuroscience important for architecture? That's a sort of fundamental question. I mean, why should we be doing this kind of thing at all? And there's a simple answer to that question. I'm going to give you a rather elaborate answer, but the simple answer is this. The design, production, use, and appreciation of and engagement with works of architecture necessarily relies upon human sensation, cognition, and behavior. Sensation, cognition, and behavior are products of the brain, so all of which seems fairly obvious. It's not a very satisfying explanation, but it's a starting point. And it's easy to come up with simple examples of this. I have a couple of good examples and bad examples of how architecture engages with the brain to enable us to behave in certain kinds of environment or not. These are two very positive examples. That's the building I work in on the left there, Lucan Salk Institute. The one on the right is Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, and both of which are incredibly inspiring works of architecture. You move into these spaces and you're overcome both by the sensory experience and the larger sort of cognitive emotional response that your brain elicits. Now, a couple of less good examples of this are shown on this slide here. Can you see my pointer when I move it around?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So the one on the lower left, I don't know if any of you have ever been there before, but this is Penn Station in New York City. It's beneath Madison Square Garden. It's a horrible place. It's a place where you wander around. There are no landmarks. Navigation is extremely difficult unless you're practiced at this. My son was an undergraduate at Columbia University, and so I made enough trips to New York during that period of time that I actually managed to find my way eventually through this. But it's the kind of place where you wander around and you have no idea where you are. The same is true, in this case, by design. For the example shown on the upper right there, that's Rem Koolhaas Seattle Library. It's a confusing building in many respects, and this was his intent, I believe, because exploration follows from confusion. The department store people figured this out a long time ago. They get you confused in the department store, and so you wander around and you find new things. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, so there are a few things I should get on the table right at the outset here. First of all, I'm not an architect. I've never had any formal training in architecture, but I spent a lot of time in the presence of architects, and I've learned a lot of things over the years. In particular, I've been part of this organization for the past couple decades, the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. I was one of the founding members. It was originally based in San Diego, but it now has tendrils that are extending out all over the world. And the premise is that as we know more and more about how the brain works, how it's organized, how it functions, we ought to be able to use that information to guide the design of the built environment, to improve certain things that people do in the built environment. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go along. So there are a couple of premises here. Neuroscience can identify principles of brain function and organization that may be relevant to building design. And I think that that's certainly true. It's not simply a premise, it's an empirical fact. And I'll give you some examples today. And from those principles, designers may ultimately find brain-based explanations for things that work and may develop novel design strategies. So these are, those of you who are practicing architects and designers know that these are important considerations when you're designing something: the site, the materials, the budget, the climate in which you're building it. There are issues of sustainability that pop up increasingly. And one thing that is implicit in all of this in design, we don't normally talk about it very much, but we all know it's true, is biology. We design for the most part, we design for human beings. And human beings have certain biological constraints that are sort of designed into the project. These are some very simple examples that you're all familiar with. The counters have to be a certain height to be functional. There has to be movement of air. The rise-run ratio of the stairs has to be correct. You need illumination sufficient to do the tasks that you're required to do. And again, we build these things in without even really thinking about it too much. But it is an accommodation to the fact that we're biological creatures. These are a few more examples, some that are a little bit more sort of second order. Metabolic needs, we need space for food storage and preparation. Infectious diseases are a big problem. You don't want to poop where you eat. Physical endurance, you want, if you build up too high, you have to make a means for people to get up to the higher levels. And so we have to build in elevators. Again, all of this is accommodation for biology. So are there mind-brain requirements for architecture? Are there things that we know about how the brain works that we can take advantage of and build in to produce a better design? And so this then calls on the discipline of neuroscience. Neuroscience is I think of it as an umbrella of many academic disciplines, many of which are traditional academic disciplines that you'd find in any university, biology, psychology, cognitive science, genetics, and so forth. And all of those collectively help us achieve an understanding of how we go from this squishy bit of tissue that's inside your head to complex human behavior. Another way to think about what neuroscience is it's a reasoned investigation of the causes and the structures of human experience, which is what we ultimately want to be able to understand, and particularly so when it comes to the experience of architecture. But there's an empirical question here. Can neuroscience actually tell us anything useful about architecture and design? I have many colleagues, both from the field of architecture and from the field of neuroscience, who say they don't see any relationship between these two things. In the case of the neuroscientists, these are for the most part people who are studying things at the cellular and molecular levels. And that's a far distance from architectural experience. And I'd like to believe that at some point we can travel across that distance, but at the moment it's not, we're not there yet. And there are people from the field of architecture who object to this kind of view, in part because it's a little bit too reductionistic and practical for their taste. They view themselves as artists. That may include some of you. I don't think that's being an artist precludes any appreciation of the value of neuroscience for architecture, but for some people, it means that it's not something they're willing to consider. But I will assume as I go forward that all of you are willing to consider this. I apologize, there's something wrong with the font on my slide here, but I think you can probably still read it, or I'll read it for you. It's useful to think about the brain when we're talking about architecture. Brain has many different facets to it, but it's useful to think about it as an information processing device. It is the most complex information processing device known to man, and it acquires information from the world through the senses. So acquisition is critical. The brain then organizes and integrates and interprets that information. The brain labels acquired information with value and affect. That is, we have emotional responses to the information that's coming into the nervous system. The brain assigns utility to acquired information. We know what things are for. We recognize. You see something that vaguely resembles a chair. Chairs are interesting because they come in many different shapes and sizes, but they're all recognizable as a chair. And so you immediately, despite that sensory diversity, you immediately know what to do with the chair. You know what its utility is. The brain stores acquired information for later use. That is to say, we have memory. And the bottom one, which I'm sad is going off the bottom of the slide for some weird reason. The brain uses newly acquired or stored information to guide behavior, to enable us to interact with the world around us. So those are the ways in which information sort of progresses from acquisition to ultimate use in the human nervous system. And I'm going to give you a specific example that's drawn from the visual system. Again, I study the visual system. That's what I've been doing for many years. And I can tell you a lot of details about how the visual system works. This is actually the part of the brain that we know the most about today. And there are sort of technical reasons why that's true. It turns out that if you're studying the nervous system, if you're studying sensory processing in the nervous system, the visual system is actually quite easy to study because it's easy to control light over space and time. And so we can get a better understanding of how the nervous system processes different forms of light and information and energy in the form of light. So this is the 30-second version of how your visual system works. This sort of orangey bit here is your brain. The wrinkly bit on the outside here is the cerebral cortex. That's the top of the brain up here. The front of the brain is on the left. And the cerebral cortex is about 3/4 of your total human brain volume. It's the part of your brain that does all the fancy stuff. And it's primarily what I'll talk about today. Now, the input to that cerebral cortex, I should say this back here on the lower right, is the cerebellum, which is involved in motor control. This is the midbrain down here, and then on into the hindbrain and down on the bottom to the spinal cord, just to orient you. So the input to the cerebral cortex from the visual system comes from this structure here. This is the eye. Light is reflected off the surfaces in the environment, and then that light is refracted. This is a lens, and I've lost my cursor. The lens in the front of the eye right there. That lens refracts the light and projects it ideally in focus onto this back surface of the eye, which is known as the retina. The retina is where energy in the form of light is transduced into energy in the form of neuronal signals that can be carried by the brain. Now, sorry, let me go back for a second. Now those signals are carried out through the optic tract here, and in the optic nerve, and ultimately they synapse. That is, these neurons end right here in a structure in the middle of your brain called the thalamus. You don't need to worry about the names of these things. It's just that the point is that there is a transferal of information from those neurons to another set of neurons that extend from that region all the way up to the cerebral cortex and to the back side of the cerebral cortex, the part of the back of your head here, which is known as the occipital pole. And that is the region indicated in blue is what's called the primary visual cortex. This is the first entry point of visual information into your cerebral cortex. I tell you all this because A, it's interesting, and B, it becomes relevant to a few things I'm going to tell you in a moment. I realize that most of you are not trained in anatomy or physiology, but this is a very sort of low-level version of how your visual system works, which I think gives some insight. Anyway, the cells in the primary visual cortex here then have projections. There are other neurons that project out, and they're moving forward in the brain. Some of them go down here into what's called the temporal lobe. Some of them go up here into what's called the parietal lobe, and they synapse on other neurons at those locations. And the way this thing works is illustrated here. That is to say, there are regions of the brain that are specialized for the processing of certain visual attributes. So motion, color, texture, these are distinct attributes of the world around us. They're very low-level attributes. We're not talking about recognizing objects. We're simply talking about the sort of basic sensory features. I've drawn them in terms of, or I've shown photographs of them in terms of objects here. But the point is that the brain is extracting the fundamental attributes. So there's some cells in a region up here that are important for visual motion perception. There's some down here that are important for color perception. And the general model that we use the metaphor that we use to describe this is illustrated by this. This is an assembly line. The idea is that everybody is a specialist. So each one of these cortical areas that's devoted to the processing of visual information is a specialist for one attribute of the incoming image. So just like the guy on the assembly line, there's one guy that puts on the fenders, another guy who does the radiators, another guy who puts in the glass in the windshields, and so on. Everybody has a very specialized job. Another thing I should have mentioned when we were back here is that this visual cortex in the human brain is about a third of the total cerebral cortex. So again, cerebral cortex is 3/4 of your total human brain volume. It's most of your brain, and a third of that is devoted to the processing of visual information, which is not terribly surprising. We're very visual animals. We depend heavily upon vision in order to survive. Now, and this sort of summarizes, and it's a lot of detail, but it's both detailed and sketchy in some ways, but it summarizes the way in which we use visual information to guide behavior. So we encounter a scene, this photograph on the lower left here, this is the arrival hall in the Delhi International Airport. And it's a rich sensory experience. There's a lot going on here. And your visual system, the first thing it does is it collects basic sensory attributes. Again, all this light is coming in through the eye and going up to these early stages of visual processing. And that light varies along a number of dimensions: color, brightness, texture. Sometimes things are moving, things are at different distances. And the first thing your visual brain has to do is resolve contrast. That is, where are there contrast boundaries? And contrast here, I'm primarily talking about luminous contrast, brightness contrast. So you can see there's contrast between the escalator rail here and the floor beyond it and so on. Then you identify the boundaries of objects. Well, you know, these are individual people, and I can identify where their boundaries are. We can infer the colors of surfaces. Well, these surfaces over here, this sort of copper color. We can detect motion. People are moving through the space, and we can identify the distances of things. There's a number of different cues indicating the distance here. The people get progressively smaller as they go off into this direction. So do these objects on the wall here, they get smaller. All these are cues that enable us to sort of figure out what's the three-dimensional structure of the scene. And from that, again, that's the first stage of processing. From that, we begin what I'll call the stage of perception, cognition, and ultimately behavior. We recognize objects. This is critical. This is what we do. In order to survive, we have to know what the stuff is around us. So this includes the faces of people, sources of food, furniture, for example. We have to be able to navigate through the space. We need to find our way to some object in the distance or some location in the distance. We focus our attention and we direct our eye movements. That is to say, the human visual system is very selective in what it processes at any point in time. You cannot enter a complex space like this and respond to everything simultaneously. You select certain things. You're looking for the place where you're supposed to meet somebody, or the place where, there's a counter where you need to go and ask somebody a question. And so you try to identify those things. And so your attention is shifting around here and there. So are your eyes, in order for you to find the things that are relevant. And that's what we call selective processing. There's symbolic communication. There are signs that help you understand what's going on. This involves reading, of course. You have to be able to read the language in order to get where you want to go. There's social communication. There's not a whole lot of social communication from this distance right here, although the layout of the scene does tell you something about the culture. But there are facial expressions or gestures that individual people make, and the clothing that people wear. All of these are means by which people communicate to you something about who they are, which is what we call social communication. Then there's emotion and affect. There are emotional responses to stimuli. This, coming into a big space like that may cause anxiety in some people. You don't really know where to go. You're trying to find somebody. Everybody looks different. There's nobody familiar. And visual imagery, we have certain expectations. We come into this, you might have gone to India having read a whole lot about Indian history. And so you have certain expectations about what you're going to see. And those expectations then color the way you actually perceive the space. There's a certain grandness to it. I don't know if you can see these little things on the wall here. These are little hand gestures that are a part of, there's actually a name for them, which I can't recall, but they're part of Indian dance. And circadian rhythms. The light in the space is constantly synchronizing your body clock. So these are all the ways in which we use this information that's coming into your visual system ultimately to interact with the world. Now, I'm going to give you a little hypothesis here. The hypothesis is built upon a couple of premises, which I'll simply read for you. The first premise is, and these things are true, I don't have the time today to demonstrate them to you in any detail, but the visual environment, both the natural environment and the built environment, has measurable statistics. And we can actually go out and measure those things and quantify them. And I'm talking about things like, the distances of stuff, the size and shapes of things, and so on. Most of those measurable statistics aren't terribly interesting, but in principle, they're measurable. And the brain has highly specific organizational properties for representing the statistics of the environment. The color and the location where there are colors in the environment. Your brain is set up to detect all these things and represent them in the activity of cells in the brain. And this leads to a hypothesis, and the full significance of this hypothesis should become clear in a few moments. But the hypothesis is that the organizational and functional properties of the visual brain facilitate the processing of statistical regularities in the visual environment. Your visual environment, indeed, under most conditions, has a lot of statistical regularities in it. That's just the nature of the world we live in. I'll show you some examples in a second. And so your brain is designed, so to speak, because it evolved that way to detect these statistical regularities. The regularities are part of the environment that humans evolved, and it's not therefore terribly surprising that the brain should have specialized detectors for those features. Now, there's a question here, that is, if this is true, this hypothesis, does that have any implications for design? And I will argue that indeed it does. So here's again, in this short talk, I don't have time to go into all the detail about these properties of the visual environment or how the brain processes them. I'm happy to talk to you about that later if you'd like. It's pretty interesting, but it's maybe a step beyond what we're doing today. But here's a consequence of that, a test of this hypothesis. that there is a facilitation of statistical regularities. So this is a complex figure. Obviously, it's made up of these little tiny, it's a completely abstract figure. It was made by a perceptual psychologist, I think about 30 or 40 years ago, and it illustrates an interesting feature of your brain, which is about processing statistical regularities of the visual input. Now, this region here is made up of a whole bunch of these little, I'll call them sandwich-looking things. I can't remember if in Central Europe there's such thing as an Oreo cookie. Many of you have probably had Oreo cookies, but these look like this very American thing called an Oreo cookie. And so there's a whole bunch of Oreo cookies that are roughly collinear here. That is, the orientation of this one is similar to the orientation of that one, and this one, and this one, and this one, and so on. And so there is it probably pops out to you, pops out as a technical term that's used in the study of the visual system. There's probably this region that pops out for you that sort of snakes along and around like that. Let's go back so you can see that again. And other than that, there's not much regularity in this image. And if I make a little bit of a change to the image, which is on the right here, so the only thing I've done now is rotate each one of these 90 degrees. So now they're not collinear anymore, and they no longer pop out. So this is an interesting feature. We tend to have this facilitation of processing of visual features that are roughly collinear. And again, they're good anatomical and physiological reasons why that's true. There's also evolutionary arguments are just so stories, but there's an evolutionary argument why this is true. The next slide might have it. Yes, we evolved in a world where this is characteristic of the things in our visual environment, the veins of a leaf, the blades of grass in a meadow, for example. These are gradually varying changes in orientation. They're not completely random from one location. Orientation is not completely random from one location to another. And so it's important that we detect these things for survival, and so our visual system has evolved with that facility. Now, it turns out we tend to build things that tap into that same, and I should stress here, I think I went over it too quickly, this is a demonstration of the fact that the statistical regularities here, this collinearity or approximate collinearity, is something that is detectable, easily detectable by your visual system. And again, the argument is it is that way because we evolved in that kind of environment, and then we build things that have those properties that make them easily detectable. These are just a couple, you don't have to look far to find examples of this kind of thing. This is by the architect Fay Jones, the Cooper Memorial Chapel in Arkansas in the US. And it has these gradually changing orientations here. This is the North Rose window of Notre Dame, in which this gradual change around a central point. And my favorite example of this kind of thing is the Cable Stayed Bridge. Cable Stayed Bridge is the most commonly built highway bridge in the world today. It turns out, for a variety of engineering and material science reasons, it's just an easy kind of bridge to make compared to many other types. But they're also almost universally regarded as extremely beautiful. This is a bridge of that sort in France. This one is about 2 miles from where I work in La Jolla, California, near the Salk Institute. It's a footbridge crossing a road here. And this is the Calatravas Corza Bridge in Jerusalem. And the thing about these cable stayed bridges, and the next slide is easy to show. My son lives in the Netherlands, and last summer we went to Rotterdam together, and this is the Erasmus Bridge in Rotterdam, which is a relatively recent bridge, built about 25 years ago. And the thing about these stays on the bridge, this is the the bridge roadway right here. And all this is supported by this giant structure here. Turns out in the end, this structure wasn't strong enough to hold the cables up, so they had to put some cables on the other side. But the cables on this side here are, the angle of these cables is varying very gradually across as we go from this end to that end there, such that this angle here is much more, it's closer to horizontal than this angle right here, which is closer to vertical. And it's that gradual change in orientation that makes these things, at least this is my theory. I don't pretend that I have a good theory of how this works, but my theory is that that makes it aesthetically pleasing. And the argument there is that these kinds of stimuli are tapping into this native organization of your brain. And by doing so, creating a sort of visual ease of processing. And that's where this gentleman comes into the picture. This is Ernst Gombrich. Ernst Gombrich was a great art historian and art theorist of the 20th century. And he wrote a number of important books on art and perception. His most famous book is called Art and Illusion, which I highly recommend. This is a book that fewer people have read typically. This one is called The Sense of Order, and it's about decorative art and both the psychology of it and our sort of obsessive need to decorate things with little patterns. And one of the points that that Gombrich makes is there is a sense of order associated with these decorative patterns. That is, regularity of patterns in space and time facilitates detection. There's a spatial understanding that comes from that. But again, Gombrich was not a neuroscientist, but he was very prescient and perceptive about how people respond to these kinds of patterns. And these statistical regularities facilitate detection, spatial understanding, and they foster an ease of visual processing. That's what he referred to as the sense of order. And we create patterns like this all the time. The example I typically give is cornice friezes. This is less, I live in California, and you don't see cornice friezes very often. Most of California was built within the last 50 years. Cornice friezes are not very common, but in Europe they certainly are. And you look at these things and there's this sort of fleur-de-lis patterns and whatnot, and they're gradual changes in orientation. They serve no purpose. What's the function of a cornice frieze? Well, it's there because it gives you this sense of order. It taps into this native organization of your brain, and architects and designers are doing this because they know it has that effect without really having a full understanding of the neurobiological reasons why that's true. Here are some other examples. This is the Nasrid, this is the tile wall in the Nasrid Palace of Alhambra, the mosaic tile. That's from 1,000 years ago. This is from the 19th century William Morris wallpaper. And again, it's this sort of gradual changing of the orientation of the contours and the pattern. Now, let's come back to this hypothesis. Again, I apologize for the weirdness of my font here. This is a hypothesis that the visual environment has these statistics. The brain has a specific type of anatomy and physiology for extracting these properties, and this leads to this facilitation of those things. Now, there's something I didn't tell you earlier about your brain that leads us to a different type of sensitivity that your brain has. This is what I told you earlier. As information comes in through the eye, it extends up here to this region in the middle of your brain called the thalamus. It then goes up to the cerebral cortex, and then it passes towards the front of the brain, both into the parietal lobe up here and the temporal lobe down here. And that's the part of the brain that accounts for what I just told you about, this sort of sense of order, or at least that's one of the things it does. But another thing we know about the brain is that we have what we call the memory store. This is where you put visual memories. So the information that you've acquired over the course of your lifetime is deposited in the sense of the formation of strengthening of connections between neurons. And that occurs for the most part for visual memories down here in what's called the temporal lobe. And those memories feed back into the visual system. And if you think about this, it makes perfect sense. The way you perceive the world is affected by what you've seen before. This is the only way we're able to survive in our world, because otherwise we'd be constantly confounded by new things that we've never seen before. We see things and they look like something we've seen before until we recognize them. I gave you the example of chairs a few moments ago. You see something that has a sort of vague, it doesn't look like any chair you've ever seen before, but it has a sort of vague structure of a chair. And so you say, oh, that must be a chair. I'll use it for that purpose. So what's the consequence of memory feeding back into this? Well, this is a simple way of thinking about it. We have the visual cortex. That's the part of the cerebral cortex that's processing visual information. And there are cells there. This has been documented many times. There's cells there, the activity of which is correlated with your perceptual experience of the world. The input to the visual cortex comes from two sources. It comes from the retina. I told you about this earlier. This is where information in the form of light is coming into your visual system, and that is being sent up through this pathway into the visual cortex. We also have information that's coming back from the memory store, and that projects back down into the visual cortex. And your experience of the world, most people are not aware of this most of the time, but your perceptual experience of the world is some combination of the information coming in through the retina, that is the information from the world in front of you, and information coming back down from your memory store, such that your perceptual state at any point in time falls somewhere along a continuum between pure stimulus at one end and pure imagery at the other end. You're usually someplace in the middle. Most people have this naive idea that, well, what I see is the stuff that's in front of me, the information, the stimulus that's coming in through the retina. But that's not true. You are constructing your perceptual state, or your brain is constructing its perceptual state based on these two sources of information. I'm going to give you a little example that illustrates this in the next slide. I'm going to show you, I think it's in the next slide, a very abstract figure. And if you recognize this figure, it's hard to do by Zoom, but I would ask you to raise your hand. Don't call it out if you recognize what this is. There you go. That's the abstract figure. Some of you may have seen this before. I've shown this figure to thousands of people. I don't know if you've seen it, but most people, when they first look at this, don't have the slightest idea what it is because it's so abstract. Now, what I'm going to do in the next slide is give you another piece of information. It's a different image that provides you a little bit more background. So there you go. Now, this one ought to be readily recognizable as a sort of crude, shadowy version of the figure of a man. Some people tell me it looks like Che Guevara. Some people tell me it looks like Jesus. I prefer Che, so I'm going to call him Che. So this is Che, and so you see Che. Everybody sees Che. Now we're going to go back to the original figure, and if we were together in the same room, I would ask you to raise your hand if you saw this as Che now, and I suspect that most of you do. And what's happened is, or what hasn't happened is the figure hasn't changed at all. This is exactly the same figure I showed you a moment ago. Your brain has changed. Your brain has changed because I gave you this piece of information, which is then providing a bias. It's a memory. Memories bias your perceptual interpretation of the world. It's biasing your interpretation of this. And this is, it's a remarkable form of learning because this is a single trial and I'm biasing in a big way your perceptual state. And it's not easily reversible. I didn't ask your permission, but I think I've modified your brains forever by doing this so that whenever you see this, you'll now see Che Guevara, even though most other people will see it as just a completely abstract stimulus. Okay. So that's a demonstration of how memory colors the information that's coming up from the retina. And there's lots of examples of this kind of thing in the world that you encounter. A favorite example is clouds that look like things. Clouds are just random objects in the sky, of course. It's water vapor. But here, I hope most of you can see the poodle in the clouds. You see this is the poodle's head up here. That's his ear. That's the poodle's nose. And he's leaping through the clouds, leaping through the sky. And again, this is a demonstration of the fact that the visual brain is a pattern finding machine. There are good evolutionary reasons why this is true. You don't want to be, I should go back and emphasize this point. You don't want to be stuck down here in the pure stimulus world, because if you're stuck there, you don't know what anything is, and there's nothing you can do with the world around you. You can't interact with that world. You don't have any perceptual interpretation. It's like this, it's just noise. And noise is likely to eat you. And so that's why we've evolved a system that combines that information coming up with it from the retina with prior information about the world, so that we can accurately interpret something, even if it's a stimulus we've never seen before. You also don't want to be stuck up at this end of things, pure imagery, because then you're just hallucinating. And that happens. There are pathologies where that happens, but under most conditions, you are and you want to be someplace in between these two. And so that's what's happening here. You're someplace in between. Now, you know perfectly well there's no poodle in the sky. And if you think that, then you have a different kind of problem. But this is your brain trying to solve this problem of interpreting new objects all the time. This is an infamous example. This is the so-called Virgin Mary cheese toast. This is a toasted cheese sandwich. The woman who made this sandwich claims she discovered the face of the mother of Jesus in the sandwich. You can see right there. There's something that vaguely looks like the image of a woman. Again, the woman who made the sandwich insisted this is the Virgin Mary, but honestly, it's just a toasted cheese sandwich. It's just noise. But again, it's the brain doing what it knows how to do and doing what it knows how to do for the purpose of survival. There's no threat associated with a toasted cheese sandwich. But your brain is applying the same rules it would apply to some other unknown object in the world. And so this is what I call perceptual improvisation. It's an active search through memory for information that enables identification, recognition, and spatial understanding of novel stimuli. And it's a very fun thing to play with. And we do this all the time. I forget whether I have I don't have a good example of this, but Impressionist art takes advantage of this perceptual improvisation explicitly. It was the Impressionists designed it for that purpose. They created really just a spark in the painting that would trigger something in your own brain, causing you to fill in the blanks using this improvisational technique. And this is concept of the 19th century concept of the beholder's share, the idea that when you go into a museum, this is true looking at a work of architecture as well, but any form of created stimulus of that sort elicits a response from the viewer such that you bring something to the table that's unique to your own prior experience with the world. Now, so just because I have the microphone at the moment, I'm going to call these two kinds of beauty. There are, of course, many kinds of beauty, and this is a sort of simple neurobiological definition of two sorts of beauty. One is the sense of order. This is this ease of processing that comes from certain kinds of stimuli that tap into this native organization of the visual system. And the other is perceptual improvisation. We need both of these in order to survive. We need a certain sense of order to give us some sort of stability in the world we're in, but we also enjoy greatly this perceptual improvisation. William James called this William James, great perceptual psychologist of the 19th century, called this the victorious assimilation of the new. That is to say, you encounter something you've never seen before, and you have this frustration. You don't know what this thing is. And like I said earlier, if you're not careful, it might eat you. And so you need to figure out what it is very quickly. And you do by association with things that you've seen before. And there's something extremely satisfying about that. That's why we go to art museums. We see things that are abstract. Oh, it looks like a such and such. It looks like a such and such. There's a whole school of thought about abstract art that you should just leave it alone and just enjoy the sensory experience. It's a very difficult thing to do because your brain is designed to bring some sort of order by relating it to what you know to be true about the world, what you've seen before. These are just some examples of, in this case, the sense of order. These are simple, regular, repeating forms. They activate specialized neuronal systems. This is what I was telling you about earlier. These have evolved because they facilitate detection of natural stimuli that confer selective advantage for survival and reproduction. The shapes of food, the shapes of the human body, these are attractive things for us for very good reasons. And we have a specialized system that's designed, neuronal system that's designed to detect these things. These are examples of stimuli that are human created, that have the same properties. This, of course, is the Sydney Opera House in the lower left. These are vases designed by the great designer of things, Eva Zeisel, who passed away about a decade ago and spent most of her adult life creating interesting shapes of this sort that are highly functional and both and at the same time very beautiful. Structural understanding is immediate. There's a visual ease, or as Gombrich put it, an easy adjustment. As you look at these things and you immediately can see the way the parts are arranged. They make sense. And this is what I'll call conventional beauty. The other type of beauty is the one stemming from perceptual improvisation. This is born from complex forms with irregular statistics. There's no specialized neuronal system for detecting these things, and detection of them in and of themselves confers little direct value for survival or reproduction. There are two photographic images on the top here. You probably have no idea what these things are. The one on the upper left here is what the state of Nevada looks like from a satellite. It's not the kind of statistics that your visual system is accustomed to looking at. The photograph on the upper right is from a microscope. This is some part of the human body here. It's stained in order to see certain characteristics of it. But again, we're not accustomed to looking at these things. They don't make any sense to us. And so if I hadn't told you what they were, your brain might be sort of chattering away, trying to improvise. What the heck is that thing? And we do this all the time in the natural world. These are examples of human-made stimuli that have the same property. Again, this is the Rem Koolhaas Seattle Library. Structural understanding is difficult. There's a visual intrigue. Is, again, in Gombrich's words, this is easy arousal. They elicit imagery, improvisation, and creative thought. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out, what is this? What are the spatial arrangement of these things? How do you get from where I am down to there? And this is, it's fascinating and engages us, and it's an important part of human cognition. The one on the right here, I always forget the name of this artist, but it's a mid-20th century abstract artist. And you look at this thing and initially it makes no sense to you, but your brain, if you've ever been to Santorini and you then look at this stimulus here on the lower right, you might see Santorini in that stimulus. And this is the perceptual improvisation process that I was just talking about. Now, let's see, where are we? So the last thing I want to do, and I don't know how much time, oh, I'm running out of time. Is that correct?
But yes.
I'll be very quick with this last little bit. It's just 3 little examples of how you might do experiments that illustrate the relationship between neuroscience and architecture. The first example is about school design. And this is an experiment that was based on the principles of a sense of order that I told you about. This is an experiment with an institution, a middle school in Baltimore, Maryland. And it was a collaboration. The person who did most of the work on this is Jim Detterman, who's an architect in Baltimore. And these are other people, including me, who participated in this experiment. But the goal was to take this middle school and redesign a classroom so that it had characteristics that would elicit this, as I put it, the sense of order. And we did that. This is an illustration of the classroom we redesigned. We put in these gradually varying shapes on the floor, on the walls, on the ceiling. We also gave them lots of views of the external environment, the outside, because again, one of the people involved in this is Bill Browning, who is one of the pioneers of biophilia or biophilic design, which leads to, it's a similar argument, but not based on neurobiology. And we tested a couple of things in this environment. We tested academic performance. These kids get standardized tests. And the gray bars are that's the control classroom where everything is the way it always was. And the biophilic classroom is the green bars. And this is a test over several months in the first year that they were in this classroom. And you can see that based on these standardized tests, these so-called iReady test scores, the experimental classroom is doing much better academically. We hypothesize that this is related to levels of stress or poor academic performance is in part based on levels of stress, and we're actually reducing this by giving these visual stimuli that elicit a sense of order. And so we measured stress. There are a whole lot of ways in which you could measure stress. There's human subjects issues because we're dealing with children in a school classroom. And so we couldn't do what you might think are simple things like measure salivary cortisol levels, which just requires taking a swab of saliva from each kid. We couldn't do that. But what we could do is measure heart rate variability. So heart rate variability is just the variability, the interbeat interval between beats of your heart varies over time. And if it varies a lot being just a few milliseconds, that's good. That tends to be correlated with low stress levels. And if it's very rigid, that tends to be correlated with high stress levels. And so this is heart rate variability plotted on the y-axis here. And this is time on the x-axis. And you can see heart rate variability for the control classroom, where we didn't do anything, is both low and constant over time. And heart rate variability for the experimental classroom is actually increasing over time, which again is correlated with low stress levels. So that's one experiment we do. And there's a bunch of controls. I could talk about this later if you have questions, but a bunch of controls we could do to further elaborate this. But it's, however you look at it, we achieved a significant increase in academic performance and a reduction in stress. Now, another brief experiment I'll tell you about briefly was one I did with John Zeisel. Interesting, John Zeisel is the son of Eva Zeisel, the great designer of things. And John Zeisel has been associated with the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture for many years. And he runs a series of Alzheimer or dementia care facilities in the northeastern part of the United States. The one we worked with is in near Boston. And the basic idea, I'm sorry, the image is a little complex here, but this is the floor plan of the facility. And these are in-house care facilities, people with severe dementia. And if you've ever been in these places, they're a little bit grim. The people, they don't like to call them patients, but the patients live in little rooms. The rooms are identical. You come out of your room, typically, you come into a hallway, you have no idea where you are. You're already compromised memory-wise, and you're put in a facility in which there are no clues to memory at all. And so these people are typically very lost. And so what we did was we created, knowing that that's true about people with dementia, we created a system using some simple display technology to try and send them personalized messages. So they all wore Bluetooth armbands, and these armbands are unique to an individual, so they give off a little ping periodically, and that's received by video monitors that we mounted in the hallway here. There are 3 of them that were mounted on, you can see on this floor plan. And when a particular individual walks by, the monitor, person comes out of their room, they walk by the monitor, and the monitor knows who that person is and sends a message saying, "Good morning, John, breakfast is down the hall to your left." And so John then knows what he's supposed to be doing at that point in time, rather than just sort of stumbling around in the hallway. Or John's brother is coming to visit him on Saturday. So it might show a picture of John's brother and say, "Good morning, John. Don't forget your brother Tom is coming to see you on Saturday." And the hope was that this would reduce, if you're familiar with Alzheimer's or dementia care patients, you know that negative behaviors are a common problem. And these are bouts of aggression directed at care workers or family, for example, or the tendency to sort of wander off And so the hope was that with a little bit more direction that could be provided by staff in the hospital or in the care facility, that we would actually get a reduction in these negative behaviors, and indeed we did. This was it was a 1-year proof of principle test, and I haven't been in touch with John Zeisel to see if he went on to do more research on this, but I show it just as a demonstration of the sort of thing that can be done. And then finally, I'll just briefly tell you about this. This is a cool new project we have going with some of my colleagues at the Salk Institute, Sergei Gepstein, Telmo Pereira, Eduardo Macano, with people at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. This is one of the world's greatest art museums. It's one of the biggest, it is the biggest art museum in the Western United States and based in the county of Los Angeles. And these are people from that museum. That's the museum, the exterior of the museum on the lower left there. That's the Salk Institute on the right. So this is the team. This is the gallery that we were assigned for the purpose of doing this study. I'll tell you what the study is in a second, but that's Sergei, that's Telmo, this is Eric Leonardis, who's a postdoc, that's Zoe Carr, who's a staff at LACMA. These are some other people at LACMA. And this is when you enter the gallery, it tells you that there's actually an experiment going on here. There's me and Sergei in front. The exhibit is a display of these ceramic objects, which is ideal for this. A typical gallery in an art museum has paintings on the wall, and we're interested in how people behave as they go into the gallery. And we're measuring this using a very high-tech means and looking at how they respond to that. We'll call that the built environment, the layout of the works of art in the gallery. And if they were just paintings on the wall, people just move around the perimeter of the room, which isn't terribly interesting. Every now and then somebody goes the opposite direction around the room, but again, we're not interested in that. We're interested in more complex behavior. These are sitting on platforms that are arranged throughout the room. And they're spectacular ceramic objects from the gallery's permanent collection. And this is the plan view of the gallery. These red dots indicate the locations. And this is 20 cameras. In the end, we use 10 cameras so as not to freak people out too much. But there are 10 cameras around the perimeter of the gallery here. And so we're monitoring. This is an elevation view of you can see the art objects sitting on platforms. Here are the platforms. And so the question is, what do people do when they come into the gallery? How are they affected by these works of art? And we're tracking them using the technique known as computational ethology. Museums have been tracking people for 100 years, and for good reasons. They need to know what people like in order to be a functioning business. And so they have people who stand in there and make little notes as you go through about what people are looking at. We're doing this using this high-tech computational means that involves video tracking. So everybody is monitored. This is all anonymous. We have no idea who anybody is, but we track people as they go through the gallery. This is actually back in the walls of the gallery. We have these 10 video cameras feeding in. And I'll just show you this little video, which is kind of cool. So this is a view from one camera. And from 10 cameras, we create a 3-dimensional reconstruction of the room. And we're in an early stage of processing these data, but this is a 3-dimensional layout of part of the room where this woman is walking when she goes through. And you'll see her walk around, and then this sort of stick figure that is computationally extracted. We want to remove all resemblance to any particular person. So the only data that we're really keeping are these stick figures. And you can see as she moves around, the stick figure is moving around in this 3-dimensional space that's reconstructed from the images taken from 10 different cameras. So again, this is the very early days in this experiment, but it's a nice example of how you can measure stuff using this kind of thing. I'm sorry, on the lower right here is a simulation. We don't have these data yet. We're just at the point of collecting them now. A simulation of what we would call a frequency plot of visitor locations, or a heat map. It shows you where people stop along the way. And I'm well over time, so I'm just going to go on and say you can apply these same kind of techniques to all the important things where neuroscience is relevant to architecture. Learning is, teaching our children is probably one of the most important things in the world today. And so improving the design based on neuroscience knowledge, improving the design of a classroom is, it's hard to think of a priority greater than that. Improving spaces for healing or creating or contemplating or meditating are all important targets. And I'll end with this nice quote from Le Corbusier. I've tried to read Le Corbusier, and I get confused a lot of the time when I read him. He's not an easy man to read, but this is a beautiful quote. The architect must, I can't actually see this because I got my thing in the way. The architect must determine the various movements of our heart and of our understanding. That is to say, the emotional responses that we have to things, as well as the way we process them. And for it is then that we will experience the sense of beauty. And neuroscience is the ticket to that. Neuroscience will bring us there. And so thank you very much. I apologize for running on a little bit.
No problem, Tom. we will have to make our Q&A a little bit shorter than usual. Can you please stop sharing your screen? So
yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for this really interesting presentation. I didn't want
Hi, Milton.
Milton is also here. I didn't want to interrupt your flow because I was also very focused and fused on all the information you're transmitting, and also thinking how to synthesize some questions to bring into this conversation. And I was very glad that you also showed not just your theory and hypothesis about the brain's need and search for regularity and order, but also the brain's tendency to look for what you call this improvisational quality. So we are also interested in finding things which are odd, which are intriguing, which are maybe even sometimes bizarre. And so I was very glad that you also brought this into the equation, because it shows also in terms of aesthetics all the endless possibilities that we have to explore, and also how even our notions of beauty, we can also think how neuroscience can bring now new components to the whole discussion about ideas of beauty. We can go further from perhaps established patterns also of thinking and classifying beauty. But I did find specifically interesting when you were mentioning this example with the tiles and also with the frieze, and how these decorative elements, they also help us to give a feeling of stability and organization in terms of our perceptual impressions. And I had to recall an episode from my childhood. I used sometimes to become a little overwhelmed with stimuli. And when I felt that my mind was too chaotic, I would deliberately fixate on patterns on the floor tiles, which in Portugal, where I come from, you probably know that we have also a lot of tradition in tiling. And I would fixate on these patterns, and that would always regulate and calm me and give me this kind of flow and order and regularity. So I could definitely relate very physically to this experience. So because you also were talking about Le Corbusier, and you even quoted him in the end, would you say, because you have also been reading Le Corbusier, that maybe one of the reasons why modern architecture somehow failed in many regards was because it left all of this perceptual complexity behind by looking for a lot of simplicity, a very rigid idea of order, a little inflexible?
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair assessment. As I said, I live in California, most of which is, it's hard to find a building around here. Again, I'm in Southern California, a building around here that's more than 30 or 40 years old. And so you don't find many buildings that are designed with those sort of decorative elements in them. And I think you're right that that's something that was lost with this. I'm a big fan of mid-century modernists, and I work at the Salk Institute. I look at this stuff all the time, but it is missing the sort of explicit decorative elements that you find in a lot of both, well, earlier in commonly European architecture. Even at the Salk Institute, however, there are subtle patterns. The form panels used for the whole thing is poured concrete. And the form panels that were used were plywood. And so you can easily, if you take the time to look at it, you can find all sorts of interesting, what I might call decorative elements in the concrete that were created by textures in the plywood form panels. But
well, Le Corbusier specifically, he was almost blind. He was blind from one eye, and the eye that could see had also very poor vision. And as he became older, his plasticity, the way he worked with concrete and so on, became more and more even exuberant in terms of what he was exploring with the textures and so on. So he was also exploring different dimensions. I think you wanted to add something. I interrupted you. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say two things. One is that we built a new building at the Salk Institute, but it's not new anymore. It's about 30 years ago. It's not a Kahn building. It was designed by Lou Kahn's colleague, McAllister, who worked on the original building with Kahn. And it's derivative, it's functional, but they developed a new form of concrete for that building, which is much smoother. It's more brittle, so it tends to have sort of surface cracks in it, but it's much smoother than the original concrete, and it doesn't have the same kind of texture to it. And so it's not, for me, it's not as inspiring as, I mean, again, I live with this, my office has got big chunks of concrete in it. And so I attend to this, but I was resonating with what you said earlier about this tendency to, I do the same thing. I look at sort of regular repeating patterns, and it's a way I have of sort of focusing my mind. There's a visual ease that comes with that. My wife will sometimes ask me, what the heck are you looking at? And I'm just looking at some regular pattern that happens to be on the wall.
It can help us to think also.
Exactly, that's right. Because it's sort of, your visual system is not doing anything else. It's just acquiring that sort of simple information. When I was a kid, the house I grew up in was a suburban tract house outside of Washington, D.C. And there was a room, in those days, houses were built with what we called rec rooms. And so this was the rec room. And I used to lie on the floor in the rec room. Rec stands for recreation, meaning it had the TV in it and, a piano and stuff like that. So I would lie on the floor and look at the ceiling. And this was a lath and plaster house, even though it was a tract house. And the ceiling had this rich textured plaster on it. And I was absolutely convinced that the people who put the plaster on had intentionally put in Civil War battle scenes, because I could see them in the plaster in the ceiling. And I'd find all sorts of elements of this. And I thought, why did they do this? Because I'm the only person who's noticing this. Why are there all these and I was learning about the Civil War in school. And so I saw the Civil War everywhere with cannons and soldiers.
But Leonardo da Vinci had this creative exercise that he allowed the mold to grow on purpose on the walls of his studio, and he would look at the mold on a candlelight and find all sorts of ideas and inspiration. And some of his drawings, even now that they're aged, they also have this kind of moldy visions in the mold.
Oh, that's great. I've never heard that story before. That's great. And this is the perceptual improvisation. So I'm contrasting these two things. The perceptual improvisation, finding stuff. It's my visual system's native ability to try and find stuff even when there's nothing there, is contrasted with this strong desire to look at something that gives me visual ease, so my brain can focus on other things.
Now I would like to make you a question which goes in a completely different direction. It's more related to the last slides which you showed. You had some examples of specific typologies, healthcare facilities, and also spaces for meditation that had a strong use of color in terms of the interior design. So I wanted to ask you if you have done any experiments that also try to see the psychophysiological effects of color in our perception, and also if they are is there any significant scientific proof that the way we work with color or certain colors can reduce stress, improve performance at work or learning? Did you do any experiments in this field?
We haven't looked at this. I think it's a great question. I mean, color has such a profound influence over human behavior, but it's so hard to sort of pinpoint exactly how that's working. There is this you may know about it, this famous story of it's called drunk tank pink.
I don't know.
The original story was, and people have told me that there's some question about how good the data are, but the original story was it was a public school system in Canada, and they had kids who were, they're being kids. They're active and running around all over the place. And they thought, well, let's try painting the walls different colors and see if there's a color that causes the kids to be a little calmer. And they found that the sort of bubblegum pink made the kids calmer. And then in some legal jurisdiction in the United States, some sheriff heard about this, and he thought, well, there's a little bit of an analogy between an elementary school classroom and the drunk tank in the police station. The drunk tank, of course, is the place. These people are not in prison. They're people who are out on the street in the middle of the night making trouble, noise, and vandalism, and they're brought in and put in this jail cell until they settle down, and then either they're charged or they're released. But they're often difficult, and so he thought, well, let's paint the drunk tank pink. And they did, and apparently it reduced this kind of hyperactive, disruptive behavior in the drunk tank. But it's an interesting anecdote. I don't know of anybody who's done systematic studies of this. I met an architect, a Portuguese architect, actually, years ago. I forget what his name was, and I forget what part of Portugal he was from, but one of his things was the use of color in his architecture, and I was intrigued by the whole thing. But and he had a whole system for it was as though he had reinvented color psychophysics, and I tried to talk to him about this, but I didn't get very far. But the idea that you can actually influence people by the use of color appropriately is something that needs to be investigated. It's hard to do in practice because we build things, we paint the walls, and then we don't want to paint them again. And so these are expensive experiments to do, but in principle, they are doable.
Well, I thought there would be a great possibility to do that because, for example, we know how that color works very well, for example, for advertising and for packaging and for all of this. And I did a few years ago some experiments with eye tracking that me and a colleague, we asked students to design a scene, and we gave them some references also from film sets, and the whole idea also that when you create a scene, for example, for a filmic experience, that you can kind of work with the color to create an atmosphere and a mood. So we worked with color in this way. And we did use this was also for my doctoral thesis, we did some experiments with, we measured heartbeat and also skin reaction. And also we used eye tracking. And it was interesting to see that at least in terms of attention, it was interesting to see how some colors really had some kind of effect. And also in the kind of questionnaires we used this more to see if were successfully creating this kind of atmosphere, so more to the emotional response and also the valence, if it would work. And we could kind of see some correlations between our aspirations with the scene and then how the people who viewed experienced it. So maybe this would be something definitely to take one step further.
I think it's a really interesting question, and they're two separate, and you mentioned this, but I'm just re-emphasizing it. The two separate effects of color that you described. One is on attention, focusing attention. And there actually is a pretty big literature on this. Color is one attribute of the visual input that increases the salience of objects. And there is a a form of attention which we call externally driven or exogenous attention, in which things that are of high salience, and it could be a flashing light, it could be something that's a bright color that's in our visual field, those sort of automatically draw our attention to that location. And that's something different, although it may be some relationship with the other. That's different from the effect of color on mood or on emotional state. And I think that's the harder thing to study, and it's probably the more interesting thing to study. I don't know many people who are doing that kind of thing.
So we have to pay attention to the time. I don't know if there's a question here in the room, in our classroom. No. So Milton has a question. Please go ahead.
Actually, one quick anecdote about color and then a question. I designed a school for highly distractible students. It was a 5-story building. They had to go up and down the stairs a lot. The teachers, when I interviewed them pre-design, said they wanted a very calm color, what would be the best color, because these distractible students were easily affected by stimulus. So I said, okay, I'll come back with an answer. So what I did was I painted the stairwells very hot colors. I painted the corridors moderate colors. And then I painted the classrooms very subtle colors. The notion was that the transition is what would give them a sense of calmness, going from the heat of those colors to something else. Because I don't know, and I didn't trust what I knew at that time about color and mood. So I just did contrast of color. But the question has to do with design agendas. Complexity is a choice. Intensity is a choice. And those choices are good or bad depending on the kind of thing you're designing. So I work with my students talking about a complexity dial and an intensity dial and picking where it ought to be before you design. How does that notion go with the way the brain works or your research?
Well, I think it depends. So I've always felt, I'll give you an anecdote. When my son was in elementary school, I used to go to his class. He's 25 now and lives in the Netherlands. But when he was young, I would go to his school classroom, and it's this typical thing where, and I remember this from when I was in elementary school also, the walls are just covered with crap. It's just, how could you possibly focus on anything in that kind of environment? Because there's just so many distractions. And there are good reasons. The teachers will tell you the stuff is up there because A, it reinforces certain things that they've learned, and B, it reinforces, by showing the work of other students, it reinforces students who've, when you've drawn a picture of a monkey or something. And I understand that, but if you're trying to study math, then having all that stuff up on the walls, you need to dial it back somehow. And we don't have until now, we haven't had the technology to do that. I mean, there are, as I'm sure you know, walls that can be slid behind other walls, so you can open up a big wall that has nothing on it, and you could write the lesson plan on that. But I saw the movie. I used to have a thing for the actress, the movie Fahrenheit 451, based on the Ray Bradbury novel, Julie Christie. I used to have a thing for Julie Christie, and she was in this movie, and she played the wife of the fireman. The fireman, of course, in the story is the person who goes and burns the books. And they lived in an apartment, and then on the wall of the apartment, and this movie was made, I think, in the 1960s. On the wall of the apartment, there was a sort of wall-sized screen in which there was a dynamic scene played out, a babbling brook or a mountain scene with birds flying. And I thought, well, that's the way, not at the time, but subsequently I thought, well, that's the way we ought to design the walls of the classroom. So we could just erase everything. So you put the work of the kids up there and the sort of reinforcers for things they've learned up there when there's an opportunity, but on other occasions you take it away. And we need that ability to sort of dial it up and dial it down depending upon what people are doing. I completely agree with that.
And it also goes to the question of symmetry and asymmetry. People, symmetry is easier to reach closure about because it's simple.
Yeah.
But asymmetry is more engaging because you don't reach closure so quickly.
Yeah. That's related to the point that the distinction I was drawing between the sense of order and the perceptual improvisation. And we need both of these things. If the entire world were just ordered and very regular and very easy to process, I think we'd very quickly get bored. So we need the sort of inspirational part of it as well. And the visual system is a great source of inspiration, finding things that we don't recognize. And what is that thing? Oh, I know what that is.
And we're also attracted to weird things. Otherwise, the whole horror segment and stories about aliens and all these things, they wouldn't be so popular. We are interested also in weird and even in the macabre. So we will have to finish soon. So I will just ask if anyone else in the audience would like to make a question. Robin, does it mean you want to make a question?
Yes, I'm thinking about not so much a question, but more musing on sort of history and our taste for natural decorations and things. And you had the wonderful expression or the image of the William Morris pattern that was up. I adore William Morris. And yesterday I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where there's a whole historical realm, but there's also a real thread of modernism that came in with Walter Gropius and his colleagues at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And we were in a building that is now an anthropology store. And it's one of the classic modern things. I think it was done by the Architects Collaborative or maybe Cambridge 7. Very modernist with everything that's horizontal is concrete this way and then glass this way. And not long after they built the building and not long after there was a lot of the white modernist houses that Gropius was building and putting up, people started desiring decoration. And one of the things that was brought in was Marimekko, and Marimekko occupied that exact building for a long time. And it was interesting in that Marimekko, which I hope most people are sort of familiar with, a Finnish company that does patterns that are abstracted, very, very bright, a little extremized in a way. So maybe it has a little bit, not macabre, but curious in a way. It's not at all what the sort of more dim things that William Morris was doing, and it's not regularized at all. So I'm sort of thinking about how this fits into kind of this historic pattern of sometimes we like things that are recognizable biophilic, and then there becomes a time where people wanted no decoration at all. And then we realized they do want decoration, but like all they could take was something that was a little more extremized. And this is also, of course, 50, 60 years ago. All of that, not to say that's not a question, just more of, I wonder how it fits in with our moods, and sort of trends at a given time, or how that might fit along the continuum of things that are unique and curious and things we haven't seen before, things that are much more familiar.
Yeah. Well, that's a big question, because I think these sort of historical cultural factors, I mean, I can talk all day about the brain, but there are these very powerful historical, cultural, and social factors that play into all of this that have to do with, in a much more complicated way, with the brain, because of course we're interacting with one another, but it's not, there's no simple explanation in terms of the visual system. But I wonder if these Marimekko patterns, I'm trying to imagine the situation with this very minimalist store design and these Marimekko patterns being sources of this perceptual improvisation. You see something novel and you're trying to figure out what that thing is. Rather than being a stimulus that would lead to some sort of visual relaxation, a visual ease.
Well, I would maybe just add to that, because I have Finnish friends, so I am familiar with Marimekko quite well. they also pick up this modern, very Scandinavian approach to modernism, which is not as regular as what we had, for example, with the functionalism in Germany and so on, but it's very playful, and it has a very strong organic quality. So I think that it was probably a good or an interesting marriage between this more austere functionalism of the original building, and then something which also comes from this modernist approach, but already a little bit more playful and less rigid, I would say. But it's also just a guess. Okay, Tom, would you like to add something?
No, it was causing me to reflect on Japanese design, because there is a strong thread of very minimalist sort of Zen-inspired architecture and design, and yet the commercial world of Japan is filled with all sorts of very strange shapes and colors,
including Hello Kitty.
including Hello Kitty, yeah. And what's the relationship between those two things? I don't know. I don't know enough about the history of it, but it's an interesting contrast.
This would be also an interesting conversation. I have to find the specialists to bring this into the catalog. Okay, we have to finish for now. So thank you very much, Tom. This was a great pleasure, and thank you also to everybody who came here, the regulars. Thank you so much for joining us, and so see you next time. Bye bye.
Okay, thank you. It was good to see you all. Bye bye.